Validation rarely feels addictive. It feels affirming, a compliment, a response, a like, a nod of approval. Something outside of you reflects you back, and for a moment you feel coherent, clear, defined, real. External feedback does more than boost confidence. It stabilizes perception. Without reflection, self-image can feel abstract. You may know who you are conceptually, but you feel it when someone confirms it. Approval sharpens identity. It reduces ambiguity. It answers silent questions. Am I enough? Am I competent? Am I visible? Am I valued? When those questions are unsettled, validation regulates. It lowers internal doubt. It softens uncertainty. It organizes self-perception. The relief is subtle, but measurable. The body relaxes. The mind steadies. External confirmation functions like a mirror, and mirrors reduce distortion. If your early environment was inconsistent, self-perception may not have stabilized internally. You may have learned who you were based on reactions. Praise meant good. Silence meant uncertain. Criticism meant flawed. Over time, your sense of self became responsive to tone, to expression, to feedback cycles, not fixed. So when validation arrives, it feels like grounding, like standing on solid surface. The absence of validation can feel destabilizing, not because you are insecure in a dramatic way, because the system expects reflection. Without feedback, self-perception drifts. You question tone, you question impact, you question worth. The mind begins scanning. Did that land well? Did they approve? Was that enough? The body waits for confirmation. And when confirmation comes, there is relief. Relief is regulatory. It quiets internal noise. This is where the subtle addiction forms, not to praise itself, to the stabilization it provides. Validation is not just rewarding, it is organizing. It defines edges. If your internal referencing is weak, external referencing becomes primary. You look outward to know inward, and each cycle of approval reinforces the pattern. Self-perception becomes contingent, not anchored. The more you rely on feedback to feel defined, the less stable you feel without it, and the system begins to expect constant reflection. Because reflection feels like clarity, and clarity feels like safety. Validation does not arrive in a steady stream. It comes in waves. Sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, sometimes absent. That inconsistency is not neutral. It strengthens the cycle. Intermittent reinforcement is powerful. When approval is predictable, it stabilizes and fades into background. When approval is unpredictable, it sharpens attention. You begin anticipating it. You check, you refresh, you reread, you replay. Waiting for the signal. Waiting for confirmation. The delay amplifies the reward. When the response finally comes, the relief is disproportionate. Not because the feedback is extraordinary, because the tension was prolonged. Tension followed by release conditions attachment. It binds you to the cycle. The body learns this rhythm. Uncertainty, anticipation. Signal, relief. Each loop reinforces the expectation that identity is clarified externally. The space between feedback becomes charged. Without reflection, self-perception blurs. You question tone. You question value. You question relevance. And the longer the silence, the louder the internal doubt. So when validation appears, it does more than affirm. It quiets. It reorganizes scattered perception. It tells you who you are again. Over time, the nervous system begins to crave that reorganization, not in a dramatic way, in a regulatory way. You begin calibrating behavior to maximize the signal. Tone shifts slightly. Presentation adjusts. Expression becomes strategic. Not consciously at first, reflexively, because the reward is clarity, and clarity reduces ambiguity. Ambiguity increases internal noise. So the system leans toward what produces response, what produces engagement, what produces reflection. The feedback loop becomes self-perpetuating. Expression leads to anticipation. Anticipation leads to tension. Response leads to relief. Relief reinforces the pattern. The absence of feedback begins to feel like absence of worth. Not because worth is actually missing, because the mirror is missing. When identity is externally referenced, silence feels destabilizing. So the loop intensifies. You seek more signals, more confirmation, more reflection. And each cycle makes internal referencing weaker, because the system has learned where stability comes from: outside. The addiction is not to praise. It is to regulation through reflection. And regulation through reflection is fragile, because it depends on cycles you do not control. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. When validation becomes regulatory, identity stops being stable. It becomes adaptive, subtle, responsive, shifting. You begin adjusting without noticing. Tone softens where approval is stronger. Intensity increases where attention spikes. Opinions narrow where disagreement reduces feedback. Not because you are inauthentic, because you are calibrating. When reflection defines self-perception, you begin anticipating the reflection. You speak toward it. You behave toward it. You express toward it. The audience becomes internalized. Before you act, there is a projection. How will this land? How will this be received? Will this produce affirmation? The question is no longer, is this aligned? It becomes, will this be approved? Approval becomes the filter. Over time, small adjustments accumulate. You emphasize traits that are rewarded. You downplay traits that are ignored. You suppress traits that create friction. Identity becomes strategic. Strategic identity is efficient. It maximizes positive feedback. It reduces disapproval. It stabilizes external reflection. But it destabilizes something internal. Because the self is no longer referenced inward. It is referenced outward. When feedback is strong, you feel solid. When feedback is absent, you feel diffuse. Like your edges are soft. You may notice a subtle anxiety in moments without response, a need to check, to confirm, to measure reaction. Without the mirror, self-definition blurs. This is identity drift, not dramatic collapse, gradual reshaping. The more behavior is shaped by anticipated validation, the less spontaneous it becomes. Expression narrows. Risk decreases. You begin living within the boundaries that produce reflection. Anything outside those boundaries feels uncertain. Uncertainty increases internal noise. So you return to what is mirrored, what is affirmed. The system is not seeking fame or praise. It is seeking stability. But stability built on reaction is unstable. Because reactions change. Audiences shift. Tastes evolve. Attention fluctuates. And when the external signal weakens, self-perception weakens with it. You may not recognize yourself outside of response cycles. Without feedback, there is uncertainty. Who am I if no one reflects me? Identity, once internally anchored, becomes externally negotiated. Negotiated moment by moment. This negotiation is subtle. It feels normal, until silence stretches. And without reflection, the self feels unconfirmed, uncertain, not erased, but undefined. And undefined feels unsafe when validation has become your stabilizer. When validation regulates you, silence feels destabilizing. No response, no reaction, no visible confirmation. And something inside begins to waver, not because you are empty, because you are unreflected. Internal referencing is the ability to remain defined without immediate feedback, to know where you stand without checking who is watching. This does not mean ignoring others. It means not requiring them to stabilize you. When internal referencing strengthens, expression changes. You speak because it aligns, not because it lands. You create without scanning. You decide without polling. You pause without panic. The silence between responses no longer feels threatening. It feels neutral. Because self-perception is not suspended in the absence of reflection, internal stability reduces the urgency for external signals. Approval becomes information, not oxygen. You can receive affirmation without organizing around it. You can receive criticism without dissolving. The mirror becomes optional. This shift is subtle. It does not eliminate desire for connection. It reduces dependence on confirmation. When feedback arrives, it adds clarity. When it does not, clarity remains. Identity stops drifting because it is anchored internally, anchored in values, in perception, in self-observation. External cycles lose their intensity. The spike of praise softens. The drop of silence steadies. You begin to notice that you feel the same with or without reaction. Not numb. Stable. The subtle addiction weakens not because validation disappears, but because it is no longer required to feel real. If this perspective clarified something internal, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not for affirmation, for awareness.